Believe it or not, this title isn't clickbait. I actually think TRT is more dangerous than steroids. Now, obviously, doctor prescribed doses of androgens aren't going to be as physically dangerous as a bunch of black market trend. I get that. But everyone gets that, and that's the point. Everybody knows steroids are dangerous and a bad idea. And while a small percentage of the population are willing to take that risk in pursuit of athletic success, most men never will. There are a lot of reasons most people choose not to, whether to avoid the side effects or perceived dangers like ball shrinking, maybe because of stigma associated with cheating or taking illegal drugs, and even for a few, wanting to just fully own their achievements, although, let's be honest, that's very few of us, right? But either way, the vast majority of men honestly probably just don't care enough about athletic performance to ever take steroids anyway. Regardless, most men are just not going to take steroids, right? Steroid use is a problem, sure. It can be very dangerous for a relatively small percentage of the population who actually take them in high doses, but that's a pretty well contained problem. It basically only affects high level athletes, gym rats, and wannabe gym rats. Kind of sad that that's a thing, but unfortunately it is. But anyway, this is a relatively small, contained portion of the population, right? Not a big societal threat. Now, TRT, on the other hand, is insidious. The dangers of TRT are not going to be as obvious as 29-year-old bodybuilders having heart attacks, so it bypasses a lot of the defenses that would prevent many men from ever considering buying steroids from that big guy in the parking lot of the gym, right? As it becomes increasingly normalized, it's likely that far more men will choose to use TRT, and it presents a lot of potential problems that just taking steroids per se, buying illegal drugs in the parking lot and getting jacked just does not. For example, look at this crazy reel that I just saw. Now, obviously, this is an outlier, but can you imagine a dad posting a reel saying, "Hey, I put my kid on anabolic steroids because I wanted him to get better at baseball"? Of course not, right? TRT opens up the door to a lot of problems that just would not happen with good old fashioned taking steroids. And that's what I'm going to get into in this video. And honestly, I don't know which of these dangers is the most important one to focus on, so I'm just going to put them in random order. All right, so before I get into the downsides of TRT, obviously this is a subject that requires nuance because TRT can indeed be valuable, even life saving medicine for those who legitimately need it, right? Who legitimately needs it is a gray area that I'll get into later. But for now, let me be abundantly clear that nothing I say here is an attack on anyone who takes TRT for legitimate medical reasons, nor am I in any way advocating that people in these categories stop taking their prescription. No, what I'm talking about here is the normalization of men taking TRT for made up medical conditions such as being over the age of 30, or hell, even being over the age of 20 now. I went to my doctor, my test was low. We've got Alec Eubank taking TRT at like 23, that kid in the reel that I showed you earlier at 16. Um, I think we can all agree that, that's a little bit extreme, but there's a gray area between that and, maybe a guy in his, I don't know, late 30s or 40s who, just feels like maybe he needs a little help, right? Anyway, there's a great, and that's kind of where that gray area is. And then there's the, like, obviously needs TRT, we're talking about like a veteran with a war injury. So between, Alec Eubank and the veteran with a war injury, there's kind of a gray area in there, right? And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So, for those men in the gray area, TRT presents a unique psychological danger, one that is completely absent in taking steroids, right? Even though physically they might be the same thing in some cases. Although, obviously, steroids are going to be higher dose than real TRT, right? TRT promises all sorts of wonderful things: better mood, better ability to work, make more money, better sex drive, maybe even a better physique, although you're not going to get a better physique from taking real TRT by itself, right? And real TRT from an honest doctor, it's not going to It's just going to get your testosterone levels up to what a normal guy would have, right? So it's not going to give you a better physique. But there are a ton of guys claiming to be on sports TRT that are kind of creating the perception that TRT does that. But anyway, I just want to make that clear real quick. Anyway, all that's required to get all these wonderful things that TRT can offer is to admit that you are fundamentally, biologically speaking, inadequate as a man. But don't worry, once you admit that and ask for help from your local pill mill, you'll get all the trappings of masculinity. You'll be able to rise and grind, get the muscular physique, the beard, the tattoos, afford a $100,000 pickup truck, and it'll all be okay. As long as you keep your injections going, that is. See how insidious that is? Like you can have everything you want. You just have to admit that you're inadequate first. And in a way, it's almost reminiscent of kind of religious submission. I think that's a little bit dangerous psychologically, and steroids don't do that. It's like, hey, I'm a good baseball player. I want to go pro, so I'm going to take drugs. Simple, right? It doesn't hit the same way, right? Steroids don't require you to make yourself a victim first. And you can say that's just wordplay, but I think it does matter. I do think it makes a huge difference. I don't think taking drugs to achieve superhuman performance is nearly as psychologically dangerous as having to take medicine just to achieve basic masculinity. Plenty of successful athletes are happy to go off cycle and be nowhere near their peak after they prove whatever they had to prove. And there isn't the same level of psychological dependence because they're returning to normal, not returning to inadequacy, right? To have a bunch of good things that are contingent on something outside your control is stressful. People don't get that. In many cases, that's actually more stressful than just having less. The precarity of it all. Now, there's already tons of that in the modern world already. It can't be helped. No man is an island. Like it or not, we are absolutely dependent on people and circumstances outside our control, for many of the good things that we enjoy, right? But I think the last thing that modern men need is for their very masculinity to become yet another area of dependency, another subscription service that they need to make sure that they can make their payments on, another pair of golden handcuffs, another reason to hustle, work overtime to make sure you can make your masculinity payments alongside your F-350 Utah Raptor HD payments, right? And speaking of payments, let's talk about what testosterone replacement therapy is. It is a drug, one that is highly likely to cause lifetime dependency. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I'm not going to get into the science of it too much, but the expert consensus, as far as I can tell, is that if you go on TRT, you should expect to be on it for life. It'll suppress your natural testosterone levels and may prevent them from ever going back to normal if you come off. And I'm not saying no one ever comes off, but being able to come off is, in my understanding, not a reasonable expectation once you go on, right? Are you sure you want to give the medical industry that much hold over you? And I know the argument is like, nah, dude, they don't want you on TRT. If they get you on TRT, then you'll start exercising and get in shape. And then you won't need the statins and the diabetes medications.
Diabetes.
And all these other way more profitable drugs. I get that, right? That's the argument, right? They actually underprescribe TRT because they're afraid of these out of control alpha males that you'll become if they give it to you, right? And you won't be a customer for other stuff, okay? All right, so look, that's absolute nonsense for several reasons. First, this narrative that doctors are too reluctant to prescribe TRT, and so many men are suffering because they can't get the medication that they need, that should set off alarm bells for everybody over 30. Because that's exactly the kind of propaganda that the Sackler family used to push Oxycontin back in the day. So before the 90s, doctors were quite correctly very reluctant to prescribe opioids, except when absolutely necessary, out of a completely justified concern that there was an addiction potential, right? Opioids, right? Addiction, yes, it's a thing, right? And doctors were correctly hesitant. But the Sacklers paid for a bunch of articles bemoaning this epidemic of untreated pain that was resulting from an outdated, superstitious fear of addiction potential, right? That was a big part of the process of changing the culture regarding opioid prescriptions in the medical industry. Now, the other part of that process was, of course, that doctors who turned their practices into oxy pill mills got filthy fucking rich. Because of course they did. How could they not? They're selling a highly addictive, dependency-creating drug to whoever wants it. Except instead of having to make sure that you're in good with the CIA, so you can get the shipments from Afghanistan or Colombia or wherever it is they're working hand in hand with the kid-touching warlords to produce the stuff, and then have to worry about the ops sending some kids wearing shiesties and skinny jeans to slide on you with a switch, you can just sell your product legally from your comfortable office, right? It's a perfect business model. The only problem is that eventually people are going to notice that more Americans are dying of opioid overdoses than all wars combined, and then crack down on some of the worst offenders. So what would fix that business model? Well, having a dependency-creating drug that you can sell legally from pill mills that does not cause overdose deaths. Problem solved. TRT pill mills are the perfect business model. Now, the objection, of course, is that it's not expensive enough for that to work. And that's where the medical industry doesn't want to give you TRT argument comes from, right? It's been around for years. There are generics, so it's fairly cheap. And sure, all things being equal, it'd be more profitable to have someone on statins or all the other obesity drugs than TRT, right? So if it were a pure either or choice, that would make sense, but it's not. You can give someone both TRT and statins, plenty of men are on both. And there are also plenty of people who would not ever take statins or insulin, but might be persuaded to take TRT. Remember, we're dealing with more or less the same class of people that has funded both sides in every war that you care to look into. Okay? They're not on the side of 300-pound body positivity influencers taking tons of drugs so that they can pretend that eating 6,000 calories a day is healthy at any size. They're not opposed to podcast listening bros with tattoos and blacked out American flags on the back of their oversized pickup trucks. They want products to sell to both sides. So they're thrilled to provide what we can call gender affirming care to 12-year-old girls whose peer group has decided to make irreversible medical decisions on a whim, but they're also happy to provide gender affirming care to 35-year-old men who don't feel like the guy from their favorite podcast says that they should, right? Overall, they'd probably have him subscribe to femininity for the rest of his life because his surgeries, would be a massive one-time paycheck and the drugs that he'd be on for the rest of his life and, that in that instance would be way more profitable. Not to mention, of course, the psychiatric drugs that they'll probably be able to sell his kids down the line if he did that. But you guys get where I'm going. Anyway, point is, if they can sell him masculinity and that's the only product that they can sell him as a subscription service, then hey, it's still good, reliable money, better something than nothing, right? Subscription services may not always be that expensive, but they provide a reoccurring income. So that's always a good thing for that business model, right? And, we're deep enough in the subscription service economy that we all know how they work, right? They start out cheap and super convenient. At first, you wonder how they can afford to provide so much value for so little money, right? That's how it always starts, right? All this stuff was good enough back in the day. You didn't really need to look too closely at how they were making it work or what the long-term business model was. And then as soon as they get you to the point where they've destroyed the competition or otherwise made unsubscribing really difficult or inconvenient, that's when they jack up the price and lower the quality. Always happens. And in this case, the product is being masculine, being a man, right? Unsubscribing from masculinity is going to be a little bit harder than Netflix. So right now they're in a growth phase where they provide you with a miracle drug that's going to make you jacked, financially successful, pretty much everything good in life with zero downsides, so they say, and at an affordable rate too. But you don't think they're going to jack up the prices once they have whatever they deem as a big enough customer base, literally by the balls? You don't think they're going to jack up the prices then, really? I want to hang out with whoever you're hanging out with to have this much trust in the inherent goodness of humanity. And even if you implicitly trust the influencer who's running your favorite online pill mill for whatever reason, just quit being naive about the modern economy. Private equity is buying up every business that could possibly squeeze vulnerable people with, right? They'd be comically evil if it weren't so horrifying and sad, like nursing homes, veterinary clinics, anybody vulnerable that they can squeeze, like cartoon villains, but, in real life. Obviously we know what they've done to hospitals, or at least I hope you do. If not, you really need to get out from under your happy little rock full of rainbows and butterflies and look at what's going on. Seriously, go into a private equity owned nursing home. Everybody should, just to get an idea of what's happening in this country and also what awaits us both metaphorically and literally. Any chance that these demonic vultures have to squeeze more money out of someone vulnerable, they're going to. Right? If you hate these people, I guarantee you don't hate them enough. There are more rabbit holes that you haven't gone down. Anyway, even if your favorite influencer who runs that TRT pill mill wouldn't squeeze you, if he wouldn't do it to you, once TRT pill mills are deemed to have a large enough percentage of the population dependent on them, the vultures are going to make your favorite influencer an offer too big to refuse, most likely using someone else's money, probably yours, probably your taxpayer dollars somehow. I don't know how that works, but somehow they got your money from Uncle Sam, what little of it isn't going overseas to fund kid bombing, kid touching, and they're going to buy your favorite influencer out. And then once they have you by the balls, literally, they're going to squeeze you for all that they're worth, okay? And it's not just about the money, so don't say, I don't care, I'm rich, I can afford it. First of all, if you're rich and you're considering going on TRT, fuck that, pay me instead. I will get you plenty jacked, more jacked than real TRT actually could ever get you. Probably more than what they're calling sports TRT even could, except in a much more satisfying way. You'll have something that nobody else at your country club would have, the real deal, the real strength and the function to go with. That's my little pitch if you're rich and you're somehow watching this video. Not that I think anyone rich probably is. But anyway, imagine everybody else at your country club, They're wearing the fake Rolexes and you're wearing the real one. That's what you would get. With me, that's my business pitch to any rich person who made a mistake and accidentally clicked on this video. And anyway, even if you aren't worried about the financial side of things that ran on, I ramble a lot, it's still a lever of control over you, right? Maybe it's just one more bill that ties you to your job and prevents you from being able to walk away if somebody tries to use your job as leverage to get you to do something you don't want to do. Obviously, we've seen that a lot already. There are several scenarios where access to medication could potentially be used more directly as a lever of control, right? There are certainly some powerful factions that seem to be very interested in more overt technocratic authoritarianism, and they seem to be doing pretty well politically at the moment. I'm not saying these folks will be successful in their ambitions. I mean, like, who knows what's going to happen in the next couple decades? But if they were successful in their ambitions, they would not be above making access to technology, including medicine, contingent upon obedience to their directives. Now, in that situation, I think it would be pretty good to be dependent on as little as possible, especially things like medications that can't be fairly easily produced at the local level. Again, and we don't need tech overlords to be successful in creating this, inescapable digital panopticon that they want to. To imagine a situation where being dependent on medication for your male hormones could be a huge liability, right? The only thing worse than an economic collapse is trying to navigate economic collapse with crash test levels, right? This wouldn't have to be necessarily Mad Max level stuff. And by the way, where were those guys getting all their gear in the wasteland? Because some of those guys were definitely on gear. I don't think that's realistic to be able to think you're going to get gear in that situation. But anyway, it wouldn't have to be that bad, just bad enough to disrupt supply chains. And now you can't get access to that stuff, right? Imagine you're in, let's say it's just like the Great Depression, except you also have near zero testosterone, right? How are you supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps then? And look, I have no idea what's going to happen in the next couple decades. No one does. I mean, but if you're comfortable being dependent on an external source of testosterone in those times, you are a lot more optimistic than I am. All right, but let's shift gears. Let's assume that things continue to go on as they are now, or maybe they even get a little bit better. They very well might. Who knows, right? So we don't have to worry about supply issues or anything like that. I'm still very concerned about the normalization of TRT usage for a couple reasons. And let's be clear, that's what a lot of people are pushing for. You see these narratives that all men inescapably have half the testosterone of their grandfathers, a quarter of that of their great grandfathers, no matter what they do because of microplastics or endocrine disruptors or whatever. That's what they're trying to say. They're trying to make the case that it's normal for men to need exogenous testosterone to be what we would consider normally masculine. That's the case they're making with that kind of rhetoric. That comes from a variety of motives, both from people who are genuinely concerned about environmental toxins and declining male health, but also from people who want to sell the cure to that particular poison. And I suspect there are a lot of people who just want to take steroids and feel better about it if they can claim that they're just trying to get back to whatever normal is in some way, and also position themselves as saviors trying to educate and help other men. And obviously, there is some truth to it, right? There are a variety of harmful compounds in the modern environment that we should be aware of. However, these really big claims about how insanely high the average man's testosterone was back in 1900 or whenever, I mean, they're barely a step above speculation. I mean, we hadn't even identified testosterone in the lab back then, so obviously we weren't testing for it. Now, there certainly has been a general decline in testosterone levels since it started being measured. That's absolutely true, but a lot of that is obesity and lifestyle. I mean, given that the scientific establishment still considers sun and red meat to both be poison, I'm not at all convinced that this data means that a modern man who lives an actually healthy lifestyle, not what they would tell you is a healthy lifestyle, would have significantly lower testosterone than his lead poisoned grandfather to any practically significant degree. And I think it's important that we, and I'm mostly talking about millennial men here, if Zoomers already think that they need TRT, then they're kind of cooked, as they would like to say. But anyway, for millennial men, I think it's important that we hold our ground against the idea that it's normal for a man to need exogenous testosterone in order to be masculine, or to build a good physique just because he's in his 30s or 40s. So I've got a 8-month-old now. It took me 2 weeks to actually film this video, or to get from like writing the script to the video. Anyway, 8 months. By the time he's in my position, it's going to be 2061. So if a bunch of us give in and go on TRT now, and even more of the Zoomers, and they're already black pilled, so they probably will. By the time my son grows up and reaches middle age, is there going to be any sort of expectation whatsoever that it's possible in any way to be masculine without drugs? That's kind of my question. And even if I can somehow raise my son right to where he does expect that and is able to do it naturally, will my daughters be able to find husbands who are able to be men the old-fashioned way? I'd like at least the option for my descendants to just be regular analog people who do normal stuff without needing exogenous injections, you know? I feel like once the toothpaste is out of the tube on that, it's going to be really hard to put it back in because everybody who goes on has to proselytize about how much better they feel and tell everyone else to go on it to feel better about their decision, right? If we don't want this to become completely ubiquitous to where it's the expectation, I think we need to just push back on it as much as we can now. Because let's be real, life is hard for men in their 30s and 40s right now. Microplastics aside, the economy is fucking rough right now. When we have kids, we're raising them on basically the hardest difficulty mode in history. Raising kids is an atomized nuclear family, one man, one woman, no help unless you pay thousands for it. That's hard. You want to give them anything remotely like what you had growing up, you have to be bringing in bare minimum six figures while also doing a ton of parenting. You know, they say having a stay at home mom in the 50s was oppressive, and in a lot of ways it was. You know, one woman alone was never supposed to do all the childcare. It was supposed to be done as a community where, you know, each mom had tons of community help. But now you as a man have to do a whole lot of what made 1950s housewives turn to mom's little helper pills while also being on your grind set as a provider and an entrepreneur, right? It's tough. You know, it's so easy to hear these influencers who are being paid by the pill mills pushing their miracle drug that gives you energy, boosts your morale, makes effort feel good, and all that. Think that's what I need, right? But struggling with the situation you're in doesn't mean you have low T. It means the situation fucking sucks. There's a saying, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. I forget who said it, but it's a saying, right? And you know what? I don't want large numbers of men taking drugs to adapt to increasing levels of hustle culture imposed by BlackRock and Vanguard. I don't want to spend every waking moment contributing to making big line go up. I want to spend as much time as possible doing absolutely nothing to contribute to the economy, you know, raising my kids, walking around looking at trees, waterfalls, reading old books, lying in the sun. So I don't want a bunch of morons taking TRT so they can wake up at 0400 6 days a week to grind on their Ponzi scheme, driving the housing prices up even more, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against hard work in general, but very few of these, you know, grind set, productive types, they're actually very few of them are actually doing anything that would traditionally be recognized as hard work. In fact, they look down upon hard work. That's trading your time for money. That's what the poors do. People without a growth mindset. You're supposed to be an entrepreneur. You're supposed to start a business teaching other people how to get rich for exorbitant sums of money. You have to invest in yourself, right? So that they can teach other people how to get rich for exorbitant sums in their own right. Right? That's what everyone's doing now, right? I don't want people adjusted to that, right? And I took them in that direction for a reason because, in addition to allowing adaptation to just overwork and hustle culture, I do think that as TRT becomes increasingly normalized, it's going to increasingly allow men to adapt to and contribute to the increasing scamification and looting of the economy. Like I was talking about earlier, you know, hedge funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, they're buying up every business and squeezing them for every penny in short-term profits they can get. They're making everything from healthcare to firefighting equipment production suck. You know, new startups are mostly Ponzi schemes to extract as much venture capital as possible before being outed as vaporware. And you know, at our level in the fitness industry, you can't look at Reels anymore without seeing an ad for a get rich quick scheme teaching you how to scale your online coaching business to six figures a month, right? Nobody wants to actually train clients anymore, even though there are tons of people who will have, you know, be happy to teach you how to make absurd sums of money doing it, right? So why does no one actually do it? Seems like everything's a scam these days, right? Now, obviously, I don't blame testosterone for the broader issues in our economy, but I do think that the normalization of TRT can exacerbate the problem by allowing a much larger number of men to adapt to and thrive in this environment. Here's the thing about natural testosterone: even if you have relatively high levels overall, it ebbs and flows. Sometimes you feel like you're in the cast of Predator, right? But not all the time. And I think that's for a reason. I think we need to be able to be that guy when we need to be, but not all the time. I think it's important for us not to feel like, you know, bulletproof men of action all the time, constantly moving from one item on our daily routine, on our daily agenda to the next. I think it's important for us to have times of reflection where we don't feel bulletproof, where we question ourselves and just kind of raw dog reality, so to speak, as the Zoomers would like to say, you know, deal with it sober, not high on testosterone 100% of the time. And because it is kind of a high, right? It feels great. And if you can be high like that all the time, maybe you can skip some of the boring, uncomfortable reflection where you wonder if being a successful entrepreneur really matters, you know, whether it really matters if your business doesn't actually provide any sort of value to anyone but yourself. If you are high on testosterone all the time, maybe you can just focus on the external metrics of winning instead, right? I don't think it's an accident that a lot of these scammers are on some form of gear. And it isn't just to look jacked with less effort. I think it also helps them quiet any doubts in their mind about what they might be doing. And this is where the normalization of TRT has way more potential societal risk than steroids. Leaders, whether we're talking about academics, political figures, businessmen, are probably not going to be buying trin and check drops from the big dude at the gym to get their bench press up, right? At least not commonly. Honestly, it might be cooler if they were, to be honest with you. I'd vote for a wide-ranging powerlifter as long as he wasn't on the Epstein list and he wasn't taking money from one particular foreign lobby that I won't mention. But that's probably not a huge overall concern either way. Anyway, TRT, on the other hand, is something that is becoming increasingly common with our thought leaders in all fields and at all levels. They say testosterone is an antidepressant for men, but you know what? I kind of want the men of my generation to be depressed, at least sometimes. Things are fucking depressing. I don't trust a man who's happy all the time because he doesn't care about the world that my kids will inherit. Now, obviously, I don't want you to be crippling depressed where you can't take any kind of positive action, but I also don't want you to be one of these farm addicts who says, I don't feel amazing all the time. What can I take to make this go away? I want you to sit down with reality some, but then actually do your best about it, right? We are in the weak men created hard times cycle, right? And it's our responsibility to make sure that the hard times create hard men and that hard men create good times part habits, right? Now, I don't know what to tell you to do about this. This is a fitness channel. I don't have all or any of the answers about the complex problems that we're dealing with in the world. But fitness isn't a bad place to start because at least that's under your complete control, right? You can't control whether the economy you live in is good. You can't control whether the profession that you choose remains worthwhile or gets ruined by private equity, politicians, or myriad other insidious and destructive forces. You can't control whether other folks are raising good peers for your kids to grow up with, but you do have full control over your diet and exercise, and at least some control over stuff like sleep, going outside, right? So physical masculinity can and should be a last bastion of independence against the ever advancing encroachments of modernity. It may seem pointless. Some of the other problems are so big, but at the end of the day, you have to think globally but act locally. Put your energy into what you have direct control over until a bigger opportunity reveals itself. If you're into examples from fiction, think about how in Lord of the Rings, Aragorn realized that the ring had moved beyond his control when Frodo left, and that he could no longer have an impact on the main point of their mission, so rather than despair, he chose to rescue two captured hobbits. Even though they were completely irrelevant to the bigger struggle, at least it was something positive he could do. So then, he and Gimli and Legolas ran for like 3 days straight, and no cardio didn't kill their gains. They gave everything they could to a seemingly minor goal, and eventually, bigger ways to contribute did present themselves, and it worked out really well, right? Or if you like real life examples, look at the channel Jim Rat and Giza. I'm going to say Giza because the new deal that the forces of Mordor have made with YouTube doesn't probably wouldn't allow me to say what I really want to say. But anyway, this guy isn't in the Great Pyramid. Sorry, he's somewhere else, right? But we're not going to say what that is, so we'll say Giza instead, right? Anyway, he was for a long time. He was in the middle of we all know what. I'm not going to say what it was, but they were basically trying to starve him out of existence for a very long time, which, by the way, is a violation of the Geneva Convention. And anyway, throughout that whole time, he was still working out. So don't ever feel like it's pointless to focus on fitness, and especially to focus on your ability to stay in great shape naturally without reliance on pharmaceuticals. You never know what good it might do. Maybe your strength will make a huge difference someday. Or maybe you just keep the tradition of building muscle naturally alive long enough to patch the torch off to my son, your son, whenever they get old enough, right? As you can see by yet another outfit change, it took me 3 days to film this. I wasn't kidding about all the stuff that modern day dads have to do being difficult. Anyhow, this was a long and rambly one as always. I appreciate your patience, but I hope I made some compelling arguments to be wary of TRT that you don't normally hear elsewhere. With all that being said, I do want to say before I close that testosterone replacement therapy is a legitimate medicine, right? Some men 100% need it, and I would never tell someone who has an actual medical condition that TRT could help with not to take it. Not at all. Please take your TRT if you actually need it and were diagnosed by a regular doctor, not, somebody who works for a pill mill. The normalization of TRT for men with no clear medical problem who just don't feel good or want to make muscle building easier, that's what I'm talking about, not guys with a legitimate medical condition. I just want to make that really clear before we close out. And I also want to announce that Barbell Apparel is kicking off their Black Friday sale early, so all pants are $99. Go ahead and take advantage of that and get yourself the best jeans in the market or whatever kind of pants you prefer. I'd also appreciate it if you take a minute to look at the books and programs available in the description, see if any of them seem to be up your alley. And if you do want to take me up on coaching, you can apply there too, or just DM me on Instagram. Unlike TRT, you can quit coaching anytime, but keep your gains as long as you do the tiniest bit of maintenance. Natty muscle is very sticky. And if you think this message was valuable and you want to get it out there about the normalization of TRT and all that, please let the algorithm know. Like, comment, subscribe, click through to another one of my videos, just anything to let them know that this is something that it should actually be pushing. All right, thanks for watching.